Good afternoon. As chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to another program in our noon lecture series. Today's guest, Dr. Herbert Aptheker, is a visiting professor of history at Bryn Mawr College and director of the American Institute of Marxist Studies. Since 1938, he has published 25 books in various areas, particularly Afro-American history. This spring, Harper & Row will publish a new book by Dr. Aptheker on Marxism and religion. The topic of today's speech is Marxism, Religion, and the Future. And I introduce to you Dr. Herbert Aptheker.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak at the university having the most distinguished philosophy department in the country. I've been asked to make an announcement, which I very happily do, that there is to be a teach-in on the third floor of the Student Union, Women's Lounge, commencing at 1 o'clock today. It's the Southern African Freedom Action Committee is sponsoring it, and this afternoon there will be a discussion of repression in Southern Africa that begins at 1 o'clock, third floor of the Student Union. There is something else I wish to say before I present the paper that I've prepared with some care. In a speech yesterday, the Vice President of the United States denounced deserters, radicals, Black Panthers, and others, as he delicately put it, who were zoo occupants. Mr. Spiro Agnew talks as though he thought of himself as Prime Minister of fascist Greece. The Vice President of the United States is a prevaricating panderer of a putrid politics, and it is exactly we zoo inhabitants who are assuring the end of his power and the power of the social assassins he represents. I now turn to the subject that I was asked to discuss. Marxism, Religion, and the Future. If you will forgive a commercial, this is a section of the last chapter of the volume which Harper will publish in May. Symbolic of the change in the realities of today's world, not least of religion's approach to Marxism and Marxism's approach to religion, is the fact that the magnificent reliefs made for the door of death at St. Peter's in Rome and the bronze bust of Pope John XXIII, which today graces the Vatican's library, are the creations of a communist artist, Giacomo Mansu. I suppose none will deny that a bastion of Catholic conservatism is and has been Dublin. Nevertheless, in 1968, the General Secretary of the Irish Workers' Party, which is the Communist Party, and a Jesuit priest marvelously named Father Sweetman, marched through the streets of Dublin arm in arm in a demonstration protesting the eviction of slum dwellers. When questioned about this on a television show, Father Sweetman said that bad housing meant bad family conditions, and the family, according to the church's teaching, was society's basic unit. Michael O'Riordan, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, a frequent political prisoner, and the communist leader, said that for his part, quote, the first Christian was regarded as an agitator. Whatever may have been true in the past, in the present, this Irish priest and this Irish communist leader found themselves together in a common effort on behalf of the despised and the forsaken. Despite the probable surprise and the possible suspicion, surely regard, maybe even love, grew on both sides. Still, let none be over-sanguine. John Kenneth Galbraith, turning to the novel Form, has one of his most sympathetic characters in it say, quoting, "Some American officials, we must face it, are not easy to reassure. If you are not a communist, they suspect you of being a stooge. If you are too smart to be a stooge, they suspect you of being a stalking horse. If assured on all these counts, they still conclude you are an opening to the left," end of quotation. With enough stalking horses, stooges, and communists, the opening to the left may yet become as serious in the United States as it already has become in the heartland of Catholicism. The strategic commitment of Marxism is to the ennoblement of man. It is not to the working class. It is not to revolution. It is not to socialism. Marxism believes that in this era, its commitment to man's ennoblement requires a basic transformation in the structure and superstructure of those societies characterized by the private possession of the means of production, and the conducting of production and distribution fundamentally for purposes of private aggrandizement. That is, it requires a revolution. Marxism believes that the central force for that kind of revolution has been, is, and will be that class divested of the means of control but placed at the center of production, namely the working class, and that the name of the social order born of such transformation, varied as it will be and has been in form, will be socialism. All these are beliefs based on considerable thought and analysis, as well as, by now, not inconsiderable experience. It cannot be emphasized, however, too often that Marxism's commitment is to man's ennoblement. If that is forgotten, one may get fanaticism, but not Marxism. The Marxist vision, of course, is not of perfection. It is of improvement and of progress. But to this, no termination is projected. And given the dynamic essence of Marxism, such a projection would be contradictory. I think it is worth emphasizing this latter point, for the contrary is often charged to Marxism. Its alleged envisioning of an end to history, of the achievement of perfection and universal happiness, is held by many to be among its signal errors, especially the characteristic differentiating it from religion and from Christianity in particular. Professor Harvey Cox, for example, believes, I'm quoting, that Marxism's future orientation is spoiled by the mistaken belief that after one more surge, history would be finished and man would triumph once and for all. He continues, quoting, Marx saw in the classless society an end to the motion generated by class conflict, end of quote. Marx saw that end, but this did not mean to him, nor does it mean to Marxism, that, using Cox's words, history would be finished. It does mean that past history's basic dynamic, class struggle, would no longer function. But this does not mean that other dynamics for example, the contest with nature, the development of science in general, and the process of criticism and self-criticism would no longer exist. The French Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac, writing on the new man, the Marxist and the Christian view, finds that both Marxism and Christianity project the achievement of perfection and completion, but that the latter, Christianity, sees this as God's work and related to the coming of the kingdom of heaven. Then, quoting, "With the achievement of the mystical body of Christ, there will be an end to tensions and antagonisms, with perfect unity fully realized." But Marxism, according to de Lubac, sees this not as resulting from supernatural intervention, but rather, his words, as the natural end of an imminent process. This, he exclaims, quoting, "without any new principle being introduced into this humanity." He is persuaded, therefore, that it is Marxism and not Christianity that expects the greater miracle. In reply, first, there is a new principle introduced into humanity, and that principle results from the termination of class struggle. Marxism thinks that with the human stage of history, a new humanity will have already begun, else that stage could not be reached, and the new stage, socialism, appear. It will make possible the further nurturing of a new humanity, one capable of achieving communism, and then in communism, further growing. Second, Marxism does not affirm the end of contradiction with the achievement of socialism or even of communism. It does project the termination of what it thinks are antagonistic contradiction, that is, contradiction containing within itself antagonisms of a basic and organic quality that constantly war with each other, and that for resolution require the extinction of one by the other, with the other then transformed. But the problems of advancing science remain. The challenge of nature persists. The errors and failings of people recur. Differences of views and emphases among people persist. An intensely critical examination and re-examination of failings and difference and projects will continue, indeed, will be encouraged. Further, Marxism, unlike utopian socialism, never asserted that with rational social reorganization, all human problems would thereby be resolved. Personal and family problems, tragedies, catastrophes, and dilemmas no doubt will continue, though it is hoped that with the development of psychological and biological sciences and the elevation of social amenities and facilities, many of these problems will be eased. In this sense also, perfection is not projected by Marxism, and the achievement of the social order it envisions will not assure universal happiness even in its own ideas. It will greatly alleviate suffering and will make possible the fuller development of human capacities. Fortunately, however, the inhabitants of even a future communist world will not be without their problems and their challenges. Science is the postulate of Marxism. It is sometimes forgotten that the victory of science over nature was achieved only in the past 2 or 3 centuries. As A.R. Hall of Cambridge University has written, magic and esoteric mystery, the elements of the irrational, were not firmly disassociated from serious science before the 17th century. He adds, rational science then, by whose methods alone the phenomena of nature may be rightly understood, and by whose application alone they may be controlled, is the creation of the 17th and 18th centuries. The insistence here that only through science may natural phenomena be comprehended and only with the same principles may they be controlled, the crowning achievements of the ages of enlightenment and reason, form the foundation of Marxism. Marxism, however, insists that that which is true for nature is true also for man. That is, Marxism holds that science not only can explicate nature and produce effective controls over it, and that nothing else can, but that science may also explicate society and produce effective controls for it, thus enhancing man's power not only over his natural environment, but over his social environment as well. As the one infinitely enhances man's condition and potential, so the other will improve both. The two together, mastery over nature and over society, can bring man out of the kingdom of necessity into the kingdom of freedom. The triumph of the principles of science in the area of nature was a most difficult and prolonged process. Its difficulty lay not only in the direct intellectual challenge involved, but also in the fact that there were enormous vested interests and powerful institutions and deep superstitions that found themselves challenged by those principles and therefore offered stubborn resistance to their victory. All these considerations, the profound intellectual difficulties and the extraneous hazards and obstacles, are present where the victory of science and society is concerned. They are in fact intensified. The intellectual difficulties because the problems are more elusive, more subtle, and more permeated by subjectivity. The extraneous hazards and obstacles because the challenge of science in society is more frontal, more devastating, more total to vested interests, powerful institutions, and deep superstitions than in the case of science's challenge to nature. Only when technique has reached the point where the age-old burdens of humanity, impoverishment, illiteracy, inequality, war, can be successfully and totally overcome, and only when the class appears whose objective interests are opposed to the maintenance of injustice and oppression, so fundamentally that its victory will make possible not only its own liberation, but also and therefore human liberation. Only when these two related phenomena appear is it possible to achieve a science of society. The victory of science in nature to the degree that it has been accomplished took many centuries and was accompanied by awful tragedies, errors, and crimes. Nor with its triumph has its form and content been fixed. On the contrary, as the detection of error is a precondition for science's advance, so the incompleteness of its grasp of reality is both a part of its nature and a guarantee of its continual development. There is perhaps some reason to hope that with the accelerated pace of historical development, the triumph of science and society may take fewer centuries. There is no reason to believe that the victory here, where the contest is more difficult, can be achieved without tragedy, error, and crime. On the contrary, alas, the relatively brief history of this contest already affords abundant evidence of all three. A fundamental conflict exists between the development and application of science in society and the nature and the idea of capitalism. Professor Heilbronner has developed this point recently with great perception, I think. He wrote, and I'm quoting just a little, "The world of science as it is applied to society is committed to the idea of man as a being who shapes his collective destiny." He writes, "The world of capitalism to an idea of man as one who permits his common social destination to take care of itself." He goes on, "In the end, capitalism is weighed in the scale of science and found wanting, not alone as a system, but as a philosophy." Heilbronner warns that while science is a majestic driving force from which to draw social energy and inspiration, its very impersonality, its value-free criteria, may make its tutelary elites as remote and unconcerned as the principles in whose name they govern. That certainly is possible if science is held to be value-free, but such an attitude, in my opinion, negates science, although it is quite common, the attitude. Since the commitment of science is to truth, and since its methodology revolves around and exists in order to ascertain truth, nothing could be less value-free than science. To ascertain reality is the first and indispensable step towards comprehension and therefore towards effective action. Where this is forgotten, one may get clerks or monsters, but he will not have scientists. For these reasons, as well as those suggested by Brunner, capitalism is deeply anti-scientific. For these reasons, Marxism rejects capitalism and embraces science. As applied to society, science has the same fluid, process-filled character as when it treats of nature. Here, as everywhere and always, the chief enemy of science is dogma. Marxism is a system of thought, not of memory. To be able to remember is indispensable, but only as an element in the process of thinking. It may not be out of place, though there be a touch of irony to it, to bring authority to bear on this question of dogma versus science. Here is Lenin from what he called our program, 1899, quote, "There can be no strong socialist party without a revolutionary theory which unites all socialists, from which they draw their convictions and which they apply in their methods of struggle and means of action. To defend such a theory, which to the best of your knowledge you consider to be true, against unfounded attacks and attempts to corrupt it, is not to imply that you are an enemy of criticism. We," Lenin said, "do not regard Marxist theory as something completed and inviolable. On the contrary, we are convinced that it has only laid the foundation stone of the science which socialists must," his emphasis, "must develop if they wish to keep pace with life. We think then an independent elaboration of Marxist theory is especially essential for Russian socialists, for this theory provides only general guiding principles, which in particular are applied in England differently than in France differently than in Germany, and in Germany differently than in Russia," end of quotation. Marxism, being scientific, is revolutionary. Its essential purpose is the elimination of exploitation and oppression. Today, this means, I think, the elimination of monopoly capitalism, colonialism, racism, impoverishment, and war. In the words of Marx, all relations, all conditions in which man is a humiliated, enslaved, despised creature must be destroyed. Were there no such conditions, there would be no revolutionary philosophy, no revolutionary movement, and most certainly no Marxism. Said Marx in commenting on the ideas and organizations of socialism just after the Paris Commune had been drowned in blood in 1871, quote, "The soil out of which it grows is modern society itself. It cannot be stamped out by any amount of carnage. To stamp it out, the ruling class would have to stamp out the despotism of capital over labor, the conditions of its own parasitical existence," end of quotation. One may profitably contrast that analysis and prophecy with the somewhat premature exclamation of Thiers, who had presided at the extermination of the communards and who had shouted in 1871, quote, "Now we have finished with communism forever." Since about 30% of the French electorate votes communist, it would be difficult for some French wit to maintain Marxism's irrelevance. In the United States, however, insistence upon Marxism's irrelevance or obsolescence has been a repeated refrain. In the Joe McCarthy era, when neoconservatism was dominant, this refrain reached deafening proportions. Today, however, what with Cuba 90 miles away and with Vietnam, and with Marxist-inspired militancy manifest among millions of youth, blacks, and impoverished people, the volume affirming the irrelevancy of Marxism has been muted. Now that even presidents of the United States belatedly notice the existence of poverty and racism, and even senators discover America to be, quoting one, a sick society, it would be quite superfluous to bring forward yet again the evidences of decay, disintegration, and delirium all about us. Two items are of interest here. In 1968, Senator Eastland of Mississippi was paid a subsidy by the United States government of over $13,000 each month for not growing cotton on his plantation in Sunflower County. In 1968, in Mississippi, a hungry child received a total of $9 a month in welfare. Mike Gorman, Executive Director of the National Committee Against Mental Illness, in preparing a report for the government in 1969, stated that there were 4 million emotionally disturbed children in the country and that about 1 million, quote, are so ill they require immediate treatment, but care is available for only 1/3 of these. The rest, quote, are bounced around from training schools to reformatories to jails. During the past decade, said Gorman, admission of teenagers to state hospitals for the mentally ill had risen 150%, and most of the youths, quote, were the worse for the experience, end of quote. If such data in a land as rich as the United States does not represent a situation crying out for revolution, then the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was in vain. The fact is that the historic scourges of man prevail widely in our country. The United States is riven with illiteracy, poverty, racism, and the preparing for and the waging of war. In the face of all this, to speak of the irrelevancy of Marxism or of its alien and conspiratorial character is a hallmark of ignorance and or complicity in an effort to retain such abominations. The reports of the UN demonstrate that a majority of mankind are chronically hungry, quite illiterate, live under conditions of indignity and inequality, and bear upon their shoulders the fearful burdens of paying for past wars, waging present ones, and preparing for new ones. Today, productive developments and social organizations have reached the point where none of these need be endured any longer. Knowledge of this momentous fact is out now. The people of the world know that they can end their suffering and that the means exist for making a life of fruitfulness, creativity, fraternity, and peace. It is this knowledge which is shaking the globe, and it is that knowledge, not thermonuclear energy, which is the greatest force in the world today. If one evaluates the accomplishments of revolutionary societies since 1917, weighing everything, it is difficult to see how one can conclude otherwise than that conditions of the bulk of the populations in the post-revolutionary societies are markedly better than was true in the pre-revolutionary societies. I do not see how one could deny this in terms of Russia and in terms of the Soviet Union, in terms of Cuba, Batista and Cuba today, in terms of Bulgaria, Boris and Bulgaria today, Queen Marie's Romania and Romania today. A modest assessment comes from Robert Maris, a professor at Cambridge University, quote, strictly socialist systems are slower to create consumer wants, but better adapted to meet, for example, the needs of the old and of the poor, and in practice really do perform better and do meet such needs. We have to admit that it is almost exclusively in the free world that we observe the extremes of poverty and affluence side by side, end of quote. These extremes are certainly about us in the United States, and when they become too public, as in Resurrection City, they are bulldozed away. In Guayaquil, Ecuador, also part of the free world, Paul Montgomery reported recently in the Times, quote, Probably the largest single industry is on 18th Street, the red light district. There, in a scene of unsurpassed wretchedness, perhaps 400 girls stand outside their stalls on an average night. Some are no more than frightened children. The standard fee is 35 cents. 3 days later, Montgomery reported from Akara, some 200 miles south of Guayaquil, that hunger was rampant. He spoke with a physician who told him, "The people are weak, listless. The children are starving. Their bones are brittle." The reporter asked, mimicking the state officials, "But what of communism?" The physician replied, "Those people, the officials, say everything is communism and revolution, but I tell you, my friend, here everything is hunger. And hunger, my friend, is a very heavy thing." Father Blas Bonpani, a priest of the Maryknoll order, recently withdrawn from his mission in Guatemala, reported his conversation with a leader of the right wing there. The priest was told that the murder of the director of a youth center was being planned because, quote, "I know he is a communist, and so we are going to kill him." The priest said, "How do you know?" And the report went on, "I know he is a communist because I heard him say he would give his life for the poor." With such a definition of communists as the priest, we may find many new names in the communist ranks, including Jesus's. Dr. Juan Bosch, former president of the Dominican Republic, asked in a recent issue of the Christian Century, "What is the blind force that keeps the United States from accepting the changes that have occurred in so many parts of the world and that must inevitably extend to Latin America?" He answered, "The force is the same as that which leads the United States to wage its filthy war in Vietnam. On the surface it is anti-communism, but that is merely the negative aspect of the real force, the profit motive. It is eagerness for profit that has made the United States the champion of the status quo everywhere in the world," end of quote. Private profit and all that it connotes is fundamental. Chauvinism and racism are related to it. James Kolayani recently summarized accurately, I think, the conventional attitude of the Roman Catholic Church, and not only of that church. Quote, "God had chosen to live in a white, capitalist, Western culture. Other cultures were either suspect or labeled outright devilish," end of quote. Kolayani's subtitle is a very important book, "The Crisis of Radicalism Within the Church." Few recent events illustrate this crisis more sharply than the furor that arose in the spring of '68, when it was learned that among those receiving Christmas gifts in 1967 from His Holiness the Pope was Luigi Longo, General Secretary of the Communist Party of Italy. When the news broke, finally, it was suppressed. An official spokesman for the pontiff said, quote, "Paul's paternal charity has no bounds." In the election a few weeks later, 8.5 million Italians voted for the Communist Party headed by Longo. This might well suggest to the official spokesman that apologies for charity dispensed to such a man were not needed. But then one reads the front page editorial in the Rome newspaper Il Tempo, voice of a section of the Curia. Quote, "A saint, St. Louis of France, kissed a leper, but the leper is not the devil. He who kisses the devil, who sends greetings to the devil, even with the most holy intentions, finds fire in his house," end of quote. If it turns out that this is the kind of house the Vatican is to be in the future, one can only say it had better be very careful of the fire next time. Quite another Catholic tradition is that represented by Peter Morin, who wrote in the first issue of the Catholic Worker almost 40 years ago. To blow the dynamite of a message is the only way to make a message dynamite. If the Catholic Church is not today the dominant social and dynamic force, it is because Catholic scholars have failed to blow the dynamite of the Church. It is about time to blow the lid off so the Catholic Church may again become the dominant dynamic social force, end of quote. That's a fine competition. Let us see whose view and whose activity will be the dominant social dynamic force for the present and for the future. Now, there are strands in the religious history and thought of our country, as in its socio-political history and thought, that offer special difficulties as well as special opportunities for Marxist Christian dialogue. The fundamentalist aspect with neoconservative offshoots make up the great difficulties. these permeated with racism as one would expect for the United States, conceive of efforts for significant social change, let alone Marxism, as seditious and diabolical. On the other hand, the United States was the heart of the New World, the land of experimentation, of equality, of republicanism, of deism, of pluralism, of utopianism, of great militancy, of the first successful colonial revolution, of a decisive civil war. Testing, said the man born today, whether this nation or any nation so conceived might long endure, in which 500,000 lives were lost, and as a result of which chattel slavery was abolished, and private property to the tune of $4 billion was confiscated. Certainly here in the United States, the great confrontation in religion between priest and prophet has occurred and continues. Here in the United States, the great confrontation between radical and conservative, between Jefferson and Hamilton, John Brown and Jefferson Davis, Calvin Coolidge and Eugene Debs, James Eastland and Henry Winston has occurred and continues. It is marvelously appropriate that the so-called discoverer of America, Columbus, remarked, quote, "Gold constitutes treasure, and he who possesses it has all the needs in this world, as also the means of rescuing souls from purgatory and restoring them to the enjoyment of paradise." From that to the Reverend Russell Conwell, founder of Temple University, and his Acres of Diamond oration, to John D. Rockefeller, the original model, and his gilded temples and slaughtered miners, is one strand. The other is enunciated by Ben Franklin in his autobiography when he said, quote, "The most acceptable service of God was the doing of good to men." How one tries to do good is viewed differently by different people, of course, but that this is the basic test of godliness lies deep in the heart of religiosity in the United States. How far he went, and that he went that far, were particular features of John Brown, but that he viewed religion as acting on earth for men and women, and especially for the least among them, were features in the life of a man from Torrington, Connecticut, that remained central to religion in the United States. In his great speech to the court prior to being sentenced to die, John Brown stressed this view. It was a view that shook the nation because it reflects a central nerve in the nation. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God, the great martyr said. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do unto me, I should do even so to them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I say I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his most poor, his most despised, was not wrong, but was right. Virginia clergymen visited John Brown in his cell. We are told, quote, one of these gentlemen said that he had called on Brown to pray with him. He said that Brown asked if he was ready to fight if necessity required it for the freedom of the slave. On the visitor answering in the negative, Brown said he would thank him to retire from his cell, that his prayers would be an abomination to God. To another clergyman, he said that he would not insult God by bowing down with anyone who had the blood of the slave upon his skirts. Brown's religion was the religion of Stephen Rauschenbusch, of Kirby Page, Sherwood Eddy, A.J. Musty, Stephen Wise, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., Harry Ward, Willard Uphouse, William Howard Mellish, Claude Williams. James Foreman's demand for reparations from dominant white America is widely held to be shocking and absurd, according to the Times. That he so far has concentrated upon the churches of America is supposed to intensify his uncouthness. Actually, it represents a mark of almost respect, since it demonstrates the hope that from that institution, above all others, positive response might be forthcoming. While institutional religion in the United States has a very bad record concerning slavery and racism, and so owes reparations really beyond mere money, the prophetic quality in religion, as practiced often by Americans, certainly formed an essential feature of abolitionism as a whole. Perhaps if that movement and its deep revolutionary reality were better understood and taught, white America today would be less startled by the present black liberation effort. For example, though everybody knows Uncle Tom's Cabin, I wonder sometimes whether anybody still reads it. There one will find Mr. Foreman's arguments almost in full, and he will find Mr. Foreman's language word for word. I will read you just a snippet. Here is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Does not every American Christian owe to the African race some effort at reparations for the wrongs that the American nation has brought upon them? Shall the doors of churches and schoolhouses be shut upon them? If it must be so, it will be a mournful spectacle. If it must be so, the country will have reason to tremble when it remembers that the fate of nations is in the hands of one who is very pitiful and of tender compassion, but of great anger. Coming right out of Mrs. Stowe is the December 1967 address of Professor Richard Schall of Princeton Theological Seminary. He's speaking on a theological perspective on human liberation. Here he is. When the old order is no longer able to serve man adequately and is too sclerotic to change fast enough to keep up with events, it will have to be brought down or broken open by conflict and violence of one sort or another. And the dynamic of God's action in the world moves in that direction. The violence of the struggle will be determined primarily by those in power. A Marxist finds himself in absolute agreement with this and would require probably the change of only one word. He would replace God with the word masses of people and rest in agreement. Surely this holds high promise for a meaningful common dialogue. For those who are deeply religious, one finds a new and most urgent note, a remarkably frank criticism of the religious establishment. Here's an editorial in Commonweal, quote, "The church has become increasingly irrelevant in our society and increasingly restricted to the private sphere. Even the language of the institutional church is that of another era, and the pomps it displays to the world are those of a feudal past. The questions churchmen raise are meaningless to the young, and they are, in addition, scandalized and repelled by much of what they see in the institutional church. Nietzsche was wrong, and God is not dead. It is the smell of decaying idols that bothers many people." Rather similarly, on the Marxist side, it is now past its first century and in living form is no longer the isolated, beleaguered, and bleeding corpus of 30 or 40 years ago. Its multinational reality inevitably induces challenges and changes. The unprecedented technical, scientific, demographic, and political developments of the past 2 decades similarly compel rethinking and new thinking. Marxism would not be Marxism if all this were not true. It is part of the essence of Marxism's beauty and validity that dynamism is its very character. The problems are momentous, and efforts at solution would be difficult in any case, given the hostile forces that remain, given the manifest dangers that persist, and given normal institutional restraints. Such efforts must be prodigious in the future if they are to succeed. But the efforts must be forthcoming within the Marxist world, since failure is unthinkable. Reflections of growth and change are clear everywhere in the universe of Marxism, and not least in thinking about and actions toward religion. From that side, this has also assisted and must continue to assist the dialogue that is mutually beneficial. The mutual process of re-examination comes out of the mutual necessity for common action against common foes. I repeat, colonialism, hunger, poverty, illiteracy, all forms of inequality, all conditions demeaning to dignity, and imperialist war. This mutuality is the firmest guarantee that the processes of reasoning and acting together will persist and grow on both sides, whatever obstacles may be placed before those engaged in this process. C. Wright Mills, in the book that appeared at the moment of his tragically early death, concluded this way: "Both Marxism and liberalism embody the ideals of Greece, Rome, and Jerusalem, the humanism of the Renaissance, the rationalism of the 18th century Enlightenment." Mills added, Marx remains the thinker who has articulated most clearly and most dangerously the basic ideals which liberalism shares, end of quote. In seeing that continuity, Mills wrote truly. In an opposite way, Joseph Goebbels expressed the same thought when, entering Paris with the victorious Nazi troops, he exulted, somewhat prematurely, quote, "Now we will finish with 1789 and 1917. In its dedication to the struggle against social evils still afflicting the majority of the human race, Marxism knows and emphasizes that its goals are common to those held by the partisans of the Enlightenment and upholders of all the great religions. Were Marxists alone in this dedication, they would persevere, but they would fail. They are not alone, however, and all who stand together opposed to systematized exploitation and systematic extermination will, exactly because they stand together, overcome the forces of evil and fulfill the promise of man." Thank you.